Hi Claire, and welcome to TFT13 in our speaker number 6 slot. So I'm looking forward to your talk today on standards. I think a lot of us out there probably don't know enough about the standards that apply to the work that we're doing. So it's going to be interesting to get the viewpoint of someone like you, who I have to say is pretty much an expert in the field. Do you want to just explain to the audience just a little bit about where you fit in the standards world?
Oh, sure. I think the first thing I'll tell you is that I got into the standards world entirely by accident. I was co-opted onto the board of ITSMF Australia, and they said, well, welcome, but everybody's got a portfolio and we've got marketing and standards free. And so I said, well, I don't know much about marketing, so I think I'd better take standards. And I learned on the job from there, as often, yes, a bit like Ian was just talking about, learning agile by doing, and standards has been a bit like that, with a lot of very, very expert and well-renowned names in the world of service management, who it's been my absolute privilege to work with, and I would no way put my expertise in any of the league with some of the great names of our industry.
It's the audience will see behind you your I don't know how anyone could get any work done in with a view like that. So showcasing a little bit of what Brisbane's got to offer in Queensland. So anyway, Claire,
right, the other way, of course, Kirsty.
Yeah. we can all look beyond you and see the lovely scenery. Anyway, Claire, I'm going to hand control over to you and get you to give us your presentation on. It's 20,000 you're concentrating on today, is it?
It is, yes, but a very special 20,000, a perfume or essence of 20,000, which I will be describing to you.
Wonderful. Okay. I'll hand over to you. I will mute and hide myself, and I will come back at the end to pose you any questions from our audience.
Okay, let's see whether I can get this working. I've had a few glitches, but hopefully this will all work. So here goes. Right, so as Kirsty has told you, I'm active in the world of standards. I'm a service management and governance consultant based here in Brisbane, and I for 4 or 5 years. Currently, I chair global ISO, that's the International Standards Organization study group on service management standards for small enterprises. So thank you to everybody who's joined from Australia and New Zealand, and also to those who are up early in Europe listening to me. I'm honoured to have your participation and looking forward to your questions. Service management has had a global standard since 2005, and Uptake is rocketing in many, many parts of the world. I want to explain in this presentation why I think that ISO 20000 is the essence of great service management, distilled down into just a few pages. So this session is going to look at what the standard is and how organizations and their customers can benefit from it. What's in it for you? I'm going to look at why bigger is not always better and more beautiful as far as standards are concerned, and indeed how being a smaller, more agile organization, to pick up on our last speaker's presentation, may help you in the implementation of ISO 20000. I'm going to look at what overlaps there are with other frameworks and standards, and also I'll have a quick look at what's out there and available to help you get benefit from ISO 20000. But first of all, let's just have a think about standards in general. There are standards, both national and global, for pretty much everything. I've pulled up a few examples here. Did you know there's a standard for how glossy your gloss paint has to be before you can call it gloss paint? That's the wonderful ISO 213. There are a myriad technical standards for everything from the dimensions of O-rings to hexagon washers to small components. And there are complex engineering standards, such as this one for bridge and gantry crane stiffness, which are going to define for us how it is that we avoid getting hurt by these things, and we have safety standards and torsion standards and so on. Then finally, there are a small but really important subset of standards called management system standards. And the most famous of those would be the quality management system, ISO 9001. That's probably the best known standard in the world. I was in a taxi the other day coming back from an ISO meeting and got chatting to the driver. And he proudly proclaimed, "We've got ISO." And what he meant was that their small organization was quality certified. What a management system standard is, then essentially it's a model to follow when you set up and you operate a management system. A management system standard should be applicable to any sort of organization, big or small, whatever its product or service is, and regardless of what sector it's operating in. It's the result of international expert consensus. There's a rigorous process which an international standard goes through before it's released to the world, which involves consultation from any country who wants to be involved. And so as a result, it can take a bit of a long time to get a standard out there. That's almost inevitable as a result of having to get the buy-in from all of the people who want to then take it up and use it. That doesn't happen overnight. So the great thing about a management system standard, once you have got it agreed and once you've got it published, is that organizations really do benefit from the global management experience and good practice which has gone into that standard. If we look at ISO 20000, first of all, let's get that long and complicated name out of the way. It stands for International Standards Organization, International Electrotechnical Commission 20,000, and that's because it's a collaboration between those two organizations. Most people will just call it ISO 20,000 or even 20,000 or 20K, and I'm going to do just that from now on. So ISO 20,000 is a certification which an organization can get. Individuals are also qualified as consultants, practitioners, auditors in 20,000, but the main use of the term is as a certification, a level which an organization has reached and has been audited against. It is recognized wherever you are in the world because it's a global standard, and that's a great thing for global business. It came from an original British standard, BS 15,000, and it was fast-tracked to be a global standard because it was getting good uptake and becoming successful, and organisations were seeing the benefits from it in the UK. So what ISO 20000 is the requirements for a service management system. And that's really the sum of the processes, the tools, the resources, and that's both people and hardware, software, equipment, that are used to plan and implement and continuously improve service management, which gives you a customer-focused, goal-oriented, and a quality-focused approach. That's a lot to ask out of one standard, which is why it's so impressive that we managed to get it into one. ISO 20000 was revised in 2011, having been around since 2005, and it was revised for two main reasons. The first reason was to get better alignment with other standards, with standards such as ISO 9001 quality management, and also 27001, the security standard. These things had evolved a little more separately than they should have done, and there are huge benefits in having those things consistent. It was also revised and this is probably the major change in there, to incorporate a service life cycle approach. Most of the ITIL version 3 came out around that time. Then ITIL 2000 introduced the concept of service life cycles to us all: strategy, design, transition, and so on. And that is reflected in which 2011. Having said that, I do have to make the point most strongly, and ISO are very, very concerned about keeping this separation, is no link between ISO 20000 and ITIL. Sure, lots of bits of it look like ITIL. You understand some of it if you've implemented ITIL processes, but there is no need for any implements ISO 20000 background or any ITIL processes in place. It's independent. You can use whatever framework you want as long as you meet the requirements in the standard. ISO 20000 started off in English and French, like all ISO standards, but it's now been translated into lots of languages. That's the Japanese on the screen. It's been translated into Chinese, Brazilian, Korean, and Russian, and so on. So it really is something which is used globally and can be accessed without having to people. So talking about global uptake, I thought you'd be interested to see number of organizations who are certified in 20,000. I have to put a big health warning on this slide. It's very difficult to get accurate numbers. One thing we desperately need is a global register of certifications, and we don't have that yet. But from the best information that I can get, India is ahead of the pack with about 1,500 organizations who are certified against ISO 20000. China has been working very hard to get organizations certified and is now probably approaching something like the 800 mark and growing fast. Japan is up there with a significant number. Japan has always been very proactive in terms of standards, probably because of their original involvement and passion for the quality management standards. And South Korea is coming along with a lot of certification. Here down the bottom there is there are a lot of conversations going on Australia at the moment about certification and why it might be a good thing for them. So why is ISO 20000 the essence of service management? Well, I think that it's the essence because in one very small document, you have got the information on what you need to do to deliver quality services to your. ISO 20000 has just 26 pages, and one of them is pretty much blank, versus, and I did count, 1,959 pages of ITIL 2011 contained in those 5 books. Now, I'm not saying that ISO 20000 contains all of the guidance and the best practice wisdom that's incorporated into the ITIL books, but I am saying that it tells you precisely what you need to do in order to deliver quality services. And there are organizations who have implemented ISO 20000 just by following the requirements set out in that standard without ever reading a word of other best practice or information. They've just gone for 20000 because it very clearly tells them what out of all of the literature that's available is important about their service management implementation. So when I talk about a requirements standard, what do I mean? Well, I've pulled out a couple of statements from the standard. Here's one. There shall be a document for all incidents. So what that means is that you cannot get 20,000 certified unless you have a procedure which is documented, which describes incidents, and there are a few more riders underneath that about what should be contained in that. Secondly, the service provider shall agree the services to be delivered with the customer. You cannot get 1,000 certificates. You discuss and agree your services with your customer. And I don't think there are many of us who would disagree with that as a principle. So the whole of that document is 26 very dry pages, possibly, of statements like that. But those solely all the requirements. So I've even pulled it up for you here so you can see exactly what's in there. So those 26 pages, a couple at the front are scope and application. There are 5 pages of definitions. Those are the definitions of language that most of us in the service management community know and recognize. Things like the definition of an incident, or the definition of a service request or a change, which have one meaning in the English language, but have a specific meaning within the service management community. So those definitions take up 5 pages worth. There are 6 pages of the actual service management system, talking about those in more detail in the next slide, and then 12 pages of the actual processes. You'll find in, for example, bibliography, things to refer to, and that's your lot. That's the standard. So not too daunting to go through, even to read. My own mind map, which I did when I first started working in these standards, so I could understand what was involved in there. So the first part I'd like to take you through is the general requirement. Now, that may be a little on a screen, so I'll just talk through very briefly. There's a requirement about management responsibility, saying that you must have management commitment, and referring a lot to top management, which is ISO for senior management, is more translatable apparently than senior management. There's a section on governance of processes operated by other parties. That's a really important section, and I'll be talking to that in a few slides. There's documentation management, version control, and so on. There's a section on resource management, and then there's the section on the management system itself. And the management system essentially is that you must have a continuous improvement management system, and that's aligned to cycle, which you know from the improvement book and other literature of plan, do, check and act. So we've got our general requirements. The next section I'll put up is the resolution processes. That's incidents and service request process and problem management. Next, service delivery processes. This is where service level management and service also continuity and availability, information security, capacity, budgeting, and accounting. Control processes include change management, configuration management, and release management processes. And there's also a design and transition process section, which says that you have to plan your new services, you have to design and develop, and you have to transition them into production via, of course, the release process. Finally, there's 2 relationship processes. One mandates that you have to have a formal supplier relationship process, and the other mandates that you have to have a business relationship process, whether that is with customers, clients, users, or whatever you call those people who use your service, whether they are paying or whether those are users of services which you're providing. you will notice that that standard doesn't have anything in there about a service strategy. You don't need one of those to get certified to ISO 20000, and there's also nothing specific areas of the standard. So what I would say is that if you look at that map, that is probably the minimum which any service management organization with a focus on quality would want to do in order to deliver services. Everything that you need has to be done in some way or other. So it's all contained in there. Let's take a look at the management system, the plan, do, check, act cycle, which the standard requires. The planning is the definition of the scope, the definition of policies, authorities, roles and responsibilities, the resources that you're going to use to implement the service management system. The doing is about the actual management of resources, the management of the processes, the risks, budgets, and so on. Checking is about monitoring and measuring and about management review. And you do have to have an internal audit process if you're going to go for 20,000 certification. And that doesn't have to be anything large and scary, but you do have to formally have one. So you have to check what you're doing and audit and report on it in some way. And finally, ACT. That's the maintenance of your management system, the continued improvement in line with your priorities and pain points, taking you round into the plan, do, check, act cycle again. The next thing I'd like to focus on from my mind map here is this part called governance of processes operated by other parties. This is probably the piece which gives people the most trouble within the standard. Governance of other processes operated by other parties is something that every service management these days. IT organisations don't provide all their IT services in-house. I'd be challenged to find one who did absolutely everything for themselves anymore. So it's a fact of life that service providers, whatever their size, depend on other parties to deliver IT services. What this requirement says is that the service provider must remain in control and accountable. So it must ensure that other parties who are supporting it in the delivery of services to its customers, to the level of service that they provide to customers, it will do that in two ways. It will either do that through the supplier management process, showed as one of the elements of ISO 20000, or it will do it through the service level management process if it has parts of an internal organisation which it relies on to deliver services. So really that's just describing the SLA and OLA and underpinning contract type concept from service management best practice. This process is important because without it, you can't, firstly, get certification to ISO 20000, but also without it, you don't really have control of your services. So I would counsel anybody who is getting services supplied from other parties to have a look at this and figure out whether the service the party is providing to achieve that service goal, make sure that things are aligned. That's probably the most strategic thing you can do in terms of moving towards 20,000 certification. On to that organisations can get from ISO 20000. And it's not just about certification. I think that all organisations benefit from ISO simply by asking their suppliers about it. If your supplier is 20,000 certified, it tells you a whole lot about them. It gives you assurance that they are that they've got a formally audited quality approach in place. It tells you that they're proactive and they're looking for continuous improvement, and that they will consult with their customers and collaborate with their customers in terms of introducing changes. So that's something certainly to take into account when you're reviewing suppliers and choosing suppliers, and it can also save you a whole lot of due diligence. Make sure that you ask them about the scope, though. Like any standard, the certification is only as good as the scope which it covers. And if you have a 20,000 certification on a very small scope, then it may not be all it's cracked up to be. Most organisations, though, will certify the whole of their customer-facing services to ISO 20,000. So, if you are asking your suppliers about 20,000, then that's a good start. If they're not certified, then you should at least ask them whether they have plans to move in a certification direction. That will also tell you something about them. Many organizations are also using ISO 20,000 for guidance. They will do a gap analysis against the requirements of the standard and use it to drive their service improvement plan. They may be out going for certification at a later date, maybe when the business justifies it, or they may just want to move in that direction because they recognize it and benefit from. Organizations who do use 20,000 just as a guidance for their improvement process report many benefits, including more efficient use of resources, productivity through proactiveness, improved risk management, and increased customer satisfaction as services and products consistently deliver what they promise. And finally, certification. If an organisation is certified, there is a bit of work involved because that organisation has to commit to a formal audit process and the repeating of that audit process every 3 years, and then an annual surveillance audit to make sure that they're still on track. Many organisations want to go for this certification to show competitive edge, and that's certainly evident in the figures that you can see for Indian and Chinese certifications. Personally, I believe that with the proliferation of cloud suppliers, it will have to be a differentiator for commercial service providers of any sort, whether infrastructure as a service or software as a service. The only thing that is probably stopping it being more of a differentiator is that not enough customers know enough to ask about it yet, and that's something that we can all help with. Also, some internal departments of larger organisations certify to show proof to their organisations that they're a quality organisation, to prove that what they're doing is up there with the best of breed. And that has certainly been something which has been an approach in a couple of organisations that I have talked to. I'd like to move on to what I see as a right-sized approach for ISO 20,000. Nowhere within the standard are there any requirements for any tools. If you want to, you can run incident management processes with a free tool or an open source tool, whatever you want, or you can run everything through spreadsheets. It just depends on the volumes that you're dealing with, information that you want. Processes can be a wiki, or they can be a short piece of paper. They can be a process diagram with notes on the boxes, whatever you want, as long as they are documented. If you're looking for certification, those processes have to be auditable, and that generally means that you need evidence, particularly about 3 months of evidence, although auditors are slightly different in terms of their requirements. So you can do 20,000 in a way that's appropriate to your scale. I know one organisation who has their 20,000 documentation in about 40 pages, I would guess. An example would be something like a capacity management process. Capacity management can be a paragraph just documenting that capacity will be reviewed, say, on a monthly basis. Current versus planned usage will be registered and recorded, and that any required actions will be taken, and that it will be a month. Who can handle things in that way. Another huge advantage that a small organization has is the agility and simplicity of communication. We've already heard talks about communication to get. I even found a formula for this, which you can read on the screen. If you do the maths, that you can find out from that on any task, a team of 4 needs, and 20 will need a communication just to its understanding of what's going on. So a small organization can really move quickly on this by having communication on a regular basis and everybody understanding what everybody else is doing. And that means that an implementation of 20,000, whether for certification or just to use the guidance available in 20,000, can actually be much speedier than in a larger organization where you have to spend a lot more overhead on communicating and organizational change management and getting everybody in line. One thing that smaller organizations are often worried about is processes and roles and ownership. It's clear that when you go through the 20,000 standard that you will find that there are a number of roles which you have to assign, and if there aren't enough people for all of those roles, then that can seem like a big obstacle to people. Now, of course, you can group those process roles together. Quite often in a small organization, the owner will be the doer as well, and that's absolutely fine. It may make sense to group roles together according to the process groupings in the standard. For example, change, release, and config would be an obvious fit that I would group together. However, I would try to keep reactive and proactive processes separate, just so that the proactive processes can get a look in. And if you can't do that in terms of your split, then just make sure that people who are responsible for proactive processes like problem management and so on have got a day, a week, or whatever it is they need to have focus on that process. Processes may be broader than service management. If you have a documentation management process within your organization which details how you manage your documents, then by all means just fit service management documentation into that. There's no need to invent something specific for it. Similarly with the financial management aspects of the standard. Finally, on this chart, I'd like to talk about internal audit. A requirement of 20,000 is that you do have to have an internal audit process. You have to have somebody who is performing that checking. And a further requirement, which is pretty reasonable, is that people who are doing internal audit won't audit their own work. Now, that may mean in a small organization that you need to split the internal audit role so different people can have internal audit responsibilities for different things, and they will just swap so that they're not auditing their own work. All of those things are perfectly doable and manageable, but they do seem to be a bit of a mental barrier to smaller organizations who are considering going down a 20,000 route until this conversation is had with them. So I hope that this presentation will start some of those seeds. The million-dollar question that I am asked a lot is, how long will it take to get certified? Well, you know I can't give you an answer to that. how long is a piece of string, but I would ask 3 questions in response to that question. Firstly, what is your scope? Have you got a relatively simple portfolio of services, or have you got a complicated and broad-ranging portfolio of services, which or service catalogue, which is going to take a little more getting your head around? Secondly, where are you starting from? Do you have a process-focused mentality? Have you done any quality or continuous improvement work? Do you have any of the ITIL processes, for example, in place? Because all of those can just be wrapped into a 20,000 certification effort. And thirdly, can you dedicate? Really hard to do this stuff if you don't have somebody who spend dedicated days on it. They don't need to be full-time, but they just need to have some protected time to look at what you've got available and to work on it. Of course, organizations use consultants for that as well, or they use a combination. So I won't answer that question, but what I will do is give you some rough ideas of what some organisations I know have done. I know a very small Australian organisation, less than 10 people, who got certified in about 5 months from beginning to end. No ITIL experience, they just had somebody who was dedicated to 20,000 and spent about 3 person months working on it. I know another organisation similarly who did this in about 6 months as well, slightly bigger organisation with some consultancy help. So it doesn't have to be a multi-year type approach. I'd now like to just have a look at the other standards, which are in the same stable. They've come from similar backgrounds, similar collaboration of international minds. This chart is aiming to show you some of the overlaps. The 3 standards which really do fit together are ISO 9001, the quality management standard, ISO IEC 20000, service management, and ISO 27001, the information security standard. This area in the middle of those 3 standards here is common to all of them. So all standards require a continuous improvement approach. They require internal audit, management reporting, document management, definition of roles and responsibilities. Between 9001 and 20,000, there's a overlap in terms of the process approach, service quality approach, service design, customer satisfaction approach, supplier management. And between ISO IEC 27001, the security standard, and 20,000, there is also a significant overlap. ISO 20,000 does talk about security. It's one of the things you have to have in place, that information security management process, but it doesn't go to the depth that ISO 27001 does. ISO 27001 does require an incident management process, a change process, availability and capacity, but all in the context of security incidents. So if you were implementing 27001, then it would think about 20,000 and what you can put in place that would be applicable to all of these. There's so much synergy between these two that ISO have just produced a document glorifying in the name of ISO 27013. That's part of the ISO 27000 series, and what it is a document which tells you how, if you've got 27001, you can go about implementing 20,000, which bits you've already done, where the common parts are, where the gaps are. Similarly, how, if you've got 20, you can implement 27001, and if you're starting from implement both of those standards, then what would be a sensible way to do that as a joint implementation, making sure as you put in your processes they will cover the requirements of both the standards. That document, 27013, was just released in November 2000. So not that many people know. It's a good resource and worth having a look at. Speaking of resources, I'd like to show you some of the things that are out there. 20,000 Part 1 is primarily what I've been talking about this afternoon. That's the requirements standard with all the tablets of stone that I described, all the shall statements. 20,000 Part 2 was released in 2012. That was by an Australian with lots of international collaboration, and that provides guidance for implementation of 20,000 Part 1. So it's still not a massive document. It's well under 100 pages. And through each of the clauses in 20,000 Part 1 and really breaks down some more of the how you could do this. 20,000 Part 3 is about scoping. That's really for audit and consultants, but who is applicable to 20,000 certificates. If you're out, you're looking at some other quality standard for certification against. 20,000 Part 5, that's a great document. It's a sample implementation plan, and it's just been agreed for publication by ISO, but it's not out yet. So there's one around that you will see, but that's relating to the previous version of 20,000. So my advice is to wait for the published update, which I'm hoping will be in 2013, because what that does is gives a whole approach with 3 tranches of implementation, suggesting what you can implement first, then what you can implement second, and so on. So it really sets out a great roadmap for progressing towards 20,000 implementation. And finally, 27,013, that document which I just talked about, which is the integrated implementation with the security standard. I'm on my last chart now, so let me just wrap up by saying that ISO 20000 is a really great resource, whether you want to certify against it or not. It was built by volunteers. So everybody who has put their expertise into this document has done it for free because they believe in our industry and believe that guidance should be available to all without having to pay a huge amount for it. Big, small organizations, and I hope that some of the indicators that I've used are telling you that it may not be as hard as you think to get benefit out of it and use it. There are a large number of benefits from certification just through checking out your suppliers to see whether they got it and assuring yourself by doing that. There are definitely some 10,000 plus companies and growing every day. Can't be wrong, can they? You can get ISO 20000 from ISO, or you can also, in many cases, get it from your national standards organization. Costs just over $100 US. None of that goes to the people who work on it. That money supports ISO headquarters costs, that's all. So I would love you to have a look at ISO 20000 and see whether you can get benefits from it in whatever way you can. And I hope that that has been informative. Thank you.
Hi, well done.
Hi, Kirsty.
That was interesting. I realise I don't know enough about standards. I know a little bit more now than I did an hour ago.
as you can imagine, Kirsty, this is something you can go on about all day.
Yes.
And I don't really want to do that. But, you know, just in terms of the 20,000 series, there's just been such a lot of work in making something which is really concise, and every sentence in there is a real nugget of you must do this, you must do that. And it's not that big.
No, that's, I mean, when you see the size of that compared with all our ITIL volumes and the rest of it, it's nice and concise. So just a couple of little questions. So ISO 20000, it really is the same everywhere you go?
A good question. People can be cynical about whether a certification in one part of the world or from one certifying body means the same as a certification from another one. I hope it's the same everywhere that you go. One thing that is happening in the advancing maturity of our industry is that there's currently in preparation some guidance for auditors, which will become mandatory and will mean that the standards for 20,000 auditing bodies all over the world will be, so it's checking that you like to make sure that we have that consistency. But one would hope so. And there wouldn't be much point in keeping on something like 20,000, would there?
Yeah, well, it certainly was interesting seeing the number of certifications in India where, I mean, I guess Australia, New Zealand, countries all around the world are using Indian IT companies as service providers. So that knowing that they've got that certification and that it does mean the same as if it was an Australian company with that certification is rather comforting.
Absolutely. But I do, speaking with my Aussie now, that it's really important for Australian companies to make sure that they're competing in the same playing field, because you could quite conceivably see the scenario where somebody is deciding whether to offshore or not, and potentially they can see that their offshore option has a better likelihood of delivering a quality service because they have the certification. So I think it's important for all companies and countries who want to compete.
Yeah, just a question that just came through from Karen Ferris was, do the internal auditors for ISO 20000 need training?
Formally, they don't need training. I mean, you would want them to have some training. There's no formal requirement for an internal auditor to be trained in any way, but if you're doing an internal audit role, then essentially you would hope to have some kind of expertise and understanding. But look, if you're talking about a small organisation, then they probably won't be able to afford to send their person who's nominated as an internal auditor on some long and potentially expensive training course. So what they just need to do is to understand that the requirement for an auditor is to check and to be objective and detached. And they will, if it's a small organisation, they are doubtless going to have some kind of knowledge about what the area they're auditing is going to be. So I think a common sense approach is required.
But there is no actual formal requirement for those internal auditors. Right. So, well, how does ISO 20000 fit with things like the Cloud Code and the Cloud Security Alliance? Is there any synergy between them?
Oh, well, that's a very Australian and that's a Kiwi question, actually, Kirsty, because the Cloud Code is a New Zealand initiative which I've been a bit involved in. I don't think it's been released yet. It's certainly out there for public draft.
Yeah, it's out there for discussion. And I certainly know of companies who are working towards being able to be seen as compliant once it is available properly.
So what it is for people who aren't in Australia and New Zealand is a voluntary code which suppliers of cloud services are going to be asked to sign up to, and then they will get a kind of cloud code logo which they will be able to show, which will just basically help in terms of their trustworthiness. It will give information on where their data is stored, what they do about backups, and so forth. But an awful lot of what's contained in there is down the line service management and security management. So the cloud code, which Australia is also looking at adopting, is essentially going to have a schedule of standards in the back of it, and within there will be 20,000 and 27,001, so that that will be there's a direct link between the cloud code and those standards, and customers will further know, and people will be able to say we're a 20,000 certified company, therefore all of the cloud code pieces about the service level agreement process, for example, which is in there, we automatically do because we have 20,000. So it's more in depth than and fuller than the cloud code, but they are linked.
Great, very good. So now, why do you think that more organisations don't actually go to their suppliers and ask whether they have ISO 20,000 certification? Surely it, when they're going for bids, I mean, you don't often see that as a requirement.
It starts a little bit, I think. I think it's lack of knowledge, Kirsty. I think that the service management industry can do a huge amount to promote standardization, and I think we should be. My call to arms for people who are watching this broadcast would be that start asking your suppliers, in particular, relying on those suppliers to provide a component of your service, then you need to have a solid contract with them. And if you want to fit in with them, if they're 20,000 compliant, then you know that their processes are going to fit much more easily into yours, whether you're going for 20,000 certification or not. And if they don't have 20,000 certification, I do see that the big organizations are mostly 20,000. The smaller organisations, not so much so. And with my small organisations hat on, I smaller organisations out of the ability to compete for some bids. I've certainly noticed that 27,001 is popping up as a requirement for bidding more, and I think that 20 will be following it as people understand the benefits of that standard.
It's been a very enlightening conversation and presentation. Thanks, Claire. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure the rest of the people who are tuning into this today and later on will also gain a lot of new knowledge from it. So I think we'll have to sign out now so we can get our next speaker lined up. But thank you very much for your time and the great wisdom that you have imparted with us today.
Oh, it's been a real pleasure, Kirsty. One more to go before you're off shift, I think. So
two left. Okay. Well, you have a pleasant evening, Claire, and we'll talk again soon.
I certainly will. Thank you very much, Kirsty, and thanks for the opportunity to participate. Bye.
Introducing MyIT from BMC Software. One quick download, and the way your users think about IT changes forever. Let's say they need a networked printer, or a Wi-Fi connection, or even a map of an office they're visiting. MyIT already knows where they are, and shows them a list of available resources and services pre-configured for their devices. Or maybe your user needs help with something more complex. With MyIT, they can do most things themselves. But if they can't, they can simply schedule an appointment with a technician who can. In short, MyIT is built to make your IT organization more modern and your users infinitely happier, dramatically changing the perception of your services